Well, good morning, church. You guys go ahead and take a seat. Perfect. So my name's Ken. I'm the youth and young adults pastor here, and if you don't know, now you know. I love when I get the opportunities to come up here and do this. So, bear with me as we make our way through. But before we get started, I do have to do a shameless plug because I am the youth guy, and we had camp here. We're talking about camp, right? And it's like kind of a big deal. I don't know if y'all know, but it's a big deal. And not only is camp being highlighted this week, but the youth group this coming Friday is doing a fundraiser to help raise some money to put money towards scholarships for kids to go to camp. So on Friday night, and I don't know if y'all are aware, men, listen, Friday, Valentine's Day. The grocery store, it smells weird when you walk in because those flower things are there. Buy some of those. If you have little ones, hand them to me. Take your wife out and go enjoy an evening on the town from 6 to 9:30. If you aren't back in time, your children will just be placed at the front of the building. I'm just kidding. No, as a youth group, we wanted to invest in the marriages in our church, and so we want to give you guys the opportunity to go and have a date night, and we'll watch your kids. So if you have kids and you want to do that, any money that goes towards that, parents put any money towards that money's all going towards helping to pay scholarships for kids to go to camp, which is a good thing. But if you can't give money or kids, give prayers, because I'm going to be babysitting teenagers and little children all at the same time. So hopefully it goes well. We're in Ruth chapter 2. And in Ruth chapter 2, right, last week we started our series, and the series is titled Ruin to Redemption. And I love how Michael kind of said this phrase at the beginning. He says, when life does what it does. And I feel like in that moment, all of us are like, I get that. Like we've all been there when life does what it does. Right? Sometimes life does what it does and we end up on a mountaintop and the world is just amazing. And sometimes, though, life does what it does and it's really hard. And in Ruth chapter 1, we were introduced to a group of people and we got to witness their response to life doing what it does. We saw in the person of Elimelech that when hardship and famine came his way, the promise of God and his land was not enough. Right? This is the promised land. Just a few books before this, we see in Joshua and Judges, this is the land that they were promised. They'd spent 40 years in the wilderness waiting to get here. And they're just now settling in, and this is the time of Judges. And so they're going through all sorts of hardships, but they're staying there. Why? Because this was the land of the promise. And then we introduced to this character that as soon as hard times came by, he left. He's like, promise is not enough. So he leaves and goes to Moab. And then we see this response of his wife Naomi as not only her husband Elimelech dies, but her 2 sons pass. And I'm not making light of, as a parent, I cannot bear the thought of having to bury my own kids. Let's not kind of breeze our way through the reality of this lady lost in her world everything. She lost everything. And her response, we read in verse 21, Naomi's response to this is she says, I went away full, but the Lord's brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. We see this bitterness take place. But what we would be remiss in not also taking note of is that Ruth lost her husband of 10 years. It's not as though Ruth and Mahlon got married and then pretty quickly afterwards, he passes. No, this was 10 years, right? It says that the boys got married, and then after 10 years, they also passed. This was not a short-term marriage. This Ruth undoubtedly loved her husband and was wrecked by the fact that he passed and that her brother-in-law had passed, her father-in-law had passed. But what stands out is Ruth's response to when life does what it does. Naomi chose bitterness. She chose anger. But Ruth's response, we see this in verse 16 and 17 of chapter 1. Ruth says, when Naomi tells her, go back, there's no point in sticking around. Any hope you had with this family, just give it up. Something happened in that 10 years where Ruth's like, I may not understand it all, but I know enough that I'm going to do what I think is right. In these 10 years, I've learned enough to know, she says to her mother-in-law, do not urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. You don't make a statement like that on a relationship that's just barely started. Ruth's not claiming to know all of the things, but she's going, what I know about God is this: I'm not going anywhere, and I'm going to do what he wants me to do, and I'm staying with you. I'm not leaving you on your own. Hardships hit both of us. I'm not leaving. I think the word that best describes this kind of faith and resolve of Ruth is resilience. And we're going to define terms. I think defining terms is important. I'll give you an example of why defining terms is important. Michael and I both agree, a notes page is a good idea for a sermon. Don't worry, I've ran this by him, so if you don't laugh, you're actually hurting both our feelings. Right, Michael and I both agree a notes page is a positive thing to a sermon. But if we had to sit down and define it based on last week and this week, what you would say is that Michael sees a notes page as a page of which there is notes on it and you can take it. I see a notes page as a page on which you can take notes on. Right? So if you didn't bring a pen and you're not ready to write down on the notes because you were expecting a little bit more there, I apologize. I encourage participation when I teach. So if you come on Wednesday nights, you'd already know this. But there's this resilience, and resilience, right, it's defined as the capacity to bounce back. In physics, the term resilience is used to refer to a material's quality to resist deformation or destruction, and indeed to be strengthened by pressure or heating. Right, it's this idea that no matter how hard you press in, if something has great resilience, it pushes back. Right, if you ever watch, I played golf in college, and if you ever get to watch a slow-mo video of a golf ball, you watch this ball that we just think is just this hard white ball that looks the same all the time. You watch slow-mo video, that ball, the reason it goes so far is it actually squeezes and deforms into this more oblong shape, and then it springs back. And in its springing back to its original shape, that actually gives it extra energy to go even farther. It has resilience. And I think when we think of Ruth and her faith, it is a resilient faith. So I want you, before we get started in chapter 2, we need to understand timeline. The events that take place in chapter 1, while it all feels pretty relatively the same, like we're just breezing through this, it's not a long book. Chapter 1 all those events take place in a span of roughly 10 plus years. Chapter 2 takes place in the span of one day. The vast majority of chapter 2, all the events occur within the span of one day. So keep that in mind as we move forward. The first point as we look into chapter 2 is that resilience produces action. Right? They're one and the same. You cannot have resilience or be shown as resilient without actions that match up. Starting in verse 1. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." So she went out and entered a field and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Right? It seems kind of weird that verse 1, verse 3, they kind of seem like they're repeating themselves. This is literature, and in writing, you do this thing called foreshadowing, right? This is the author's way of saying this Boaz guy, he's going to be important. Pay attention, right? So, hence the repetition. But Ruth asked permission to leave and go. Like, she's going to go. She's like, hey, we need food. This is the way we get food. The Levitical laws had certain things in place that took care of orphans and widows and foreigners. And Ruth kind of, she hits all the marks for falling within that category. But we also have to understand this wasn't just like probably a very casual thing, right? She has this statement, in whose eyes I may find favor. The reality is her leaving as a widow and going to these fields of complete strangers as a foreigner, there's a lot of risks involved in this. This wasn't like a safe bet that she was going to have a good day. Because just as much as there were laws in place to take care of the foreigner and the widow, the end of Judges, the book right before Ruth, right, which the start of Ruth says, during the time of Judges, the book of Judges ends with this verse: everyone did what they thought was right in their own eyes. It doesn't say that everyone did what was right. Right in their own eyes. She was risking, really, her life, in a sense. But in the end, she has to go and get food. She's not going to sit in the house and do nothing. So in the face of all this hardship, she still has to go and take action. So she goes out and she begins to glean. This is the second point. Our actions are seen by others. Our actions are seen by others. We continue in verse 4. Just then, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted his harvesters. "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they answered. Classic ancient Israel greeting. Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters, "Who does that young woman belong to?" Right off the bat, Ruth takes action. Ruth is seen. He sees her. She stands out. The overseer replied, "She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi." She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters." She came into the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. Not just Boaz took notice of her, but the workers themselves took notice of her. They took notice of the fact that she's the one that came back with Naomi. She's being seen. So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along with the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from water jars the men have filled." At this she bowed down with her face to the ground, and she asked him, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Listen to Boaz's response. "I have been told about all what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. How you left your father and your mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wing you have come to take refuge." Her actions are being noticed. And it's her actions that actually inform people about the kind of person she is. This isn't a foreign concept, and definitely shouldn't be foreign to us as those who claim to be followers of Christ. This precedent is set for us very clearly in the New Testament. During the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says in Matthew 5, verse 16, "In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven." Peter, in his letter to the church, 1 Peter 2, verse 12, "Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us." Paul, in his letter to the church in Thessalonica, 1 Thessalonians 4, 11 through 12, "Make it your ambition to lead a quiet life. Mind your own business and work with your hands, just as we told you, so that your daily life may win the respect of outsiders." Our actions are seen, and our actions display who we are. Ruth's resilience led her to action. Action then kind of starts this domino effect in her life. The next point that we see, right, and as we're kind of just, this is the momentum of how this is going, right? Hopefully this is just making sense. Faith in action blesses others. That when we take action and we take action out of faith, that there's actually positive benefits for others, not just ourselves. Sometimes not even ourselves. Faith in action blesses others. Let's continue in the story of Ruth. Verse 13, chapter 2. Ruth says, "May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord. You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants." At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar." When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain, and she ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men, "Let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks for her and from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up and don't rebuke her." Right, this is kind of a romance story if you're familiar with the story of Ruth. Right? I don't want to spoil the ending if you're new to it, but it's heading in a specific direction. And so the tendency is for some of us, if we already know what's going on, we're kind of like, they're in that phase where like they like each other and they're like, you know, like she likes him and he likes her, but they're not ready to like say it out loud kind of a thing. Everyone else is like, "Oh, we know." Like, we know. No, I mean, honestly, like we could read into it that way, but truthfully also we could see that Boaz is a man of integrity. As he's described in verse 1, a man of standing. Boaz is doing what he knows is right. And so he's acting just as much in faith. And he's giving of the abundance that God had given him right after a famine. And he's looking at his crops and he's saying, you know what? Her and Naomi need this. And even though it's taking away from what I could save and set aside for myself, the right thing is to take care of her and her mother-in-law. He's acting in faith, and his actions bless Ruth and Naomi. And actually, as we continue reading, we see that not only does Boaz's actions bless Naomi, but Ruth's actions bless Naomi. She kind of started this whole domino effect by taking these actions. We start back in at verse 17. It says, "So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah." It's 30 pounds. It's a fair haul. It's a decent amount of seeds, right? She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. Her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." And then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz," she said. In the end, Boaz didn't go and just tell her to go sit under the shelter and just keep eating and other people would gather for her. No, she went and gathered it. Ruth's taking action. Now remember, timeline. Chapter 1, span of over 10 years. By all accounts, what we read in those final verses of chapter 1 could be the very day before chapter 2. It's probably not very likely that Ruth got back from Bethlehem and was like, you know what? Probably fine not eating for a few days, and then after I've rested, I'll go and... It's probably the very next day. So Ruth's taking action, and these things, remember, the Naomi that we heard potentially less than 24 hours ago speaks with a heart that has clearly been so bitter after 10 plus years of heartache. And here in the span of a 24-hour time period, we see that faithful actions help to remove a bitter root. As we read in verse 20, Naomi's response: "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead." She's speaking of Boaz. She added, "That man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers." Now, if you'd have said within 24 hours of the words from Naomi that we read in chapter 1, we would hear this much hope and joy in her words. 24 hours later. If that alone doesn't make the case for faithful actions, blessing others around us. Whew. This is an incredible work in the heart. Incredible. It should blow us away to read these words. This is not the same Naomi. She's speaking as though there's hope for a future. And she just said the chapter 1, it's all over. Could you imagine being Ruth? She's walking into town. Folks are like, "Hey, this is Naomi." And then Naomi's like, "I've come back empty." I don't know. In my head, I'm just kind of a spaz, so I think funny thoughts. But I just imagine Ruth in the background just kind of well, you're not completely empty. Kind of have at least one person's with you. Come on. But Ruth takes action. She shows her resilience, and it begins to bless 10 years of bitterness and hurt. John Chrysostom, an early church father with a funny last name. He was from the time about the 3rd century, 2nd to 3rd century. He died in about like 407 AD. But he has this phrase that I just think, for its simplicity, it's so powerful. He says this: faithfulness in little things is a big thing. Faithfulness in little things is a big thing. All of a sudden, that mustard seed and that mountain start making sense from the words of Jesus. But this is the final point. Resilience is shown over time. By all accounts, chapter 2, right up until we get to the last verse of chapter 2, this is, remember, one day, 24-hour time frame. And we could be tempted to think to ourselves, the problems have been solved. Yay! It just took one day. I can pull off one day. That's not resilience. Resilience is time invested. So I kind of have I like strange things, and I'm gonna explain myself to not leave that out there. So there's this guy called Ross Edgley, and I've been a fan of him for quite a while. He's a fitness guy. He's got a few books like The World's Fittest Book and some other things that he's done. But he's just all about this idea of like finding what does it mean to reach the peak of being a human, of what is the human body capable of, and ultimately what he tends to find is that like the reality is your mind will quit before your body will. Your mind will quit before your body will. Like he did this thing called the triathlon, where he does a full triathlon, which is like, a swim and a bike and then a run, while dragging a 100-pound tree behind him. Like you're just like, why? But why? Right? Like most of the time you hear what he did and you're like, and at first you're like, wow. And then the second thought is like, but why? Like that's just kind of weird, right? So Ross Edgley, he had this thing, and I followed him the whole way while he was doing this. And he did this thing called the Great British Swim. And over the course of 157 days, he swam 1,780 miles all the way around the island of Great Britain. Again, you're just like, wow. But why, right? So he starts in this town called Margate. It's kind of on the southern section of the island of the United Kingdom. And he starts and he heads west, right? He goes around Plymouth and then heads up through the Isle of Man and comes all the way back down, right? So he didn't do it like nonstop swimming for 157 days. Let's just understand this. Like, he would not be alive. He'd be at the bottom somewhere, probably actually close to where he started. But he had a sailboat follow him, and he did not touch land again until that 157th day when he swam to the shores of Margate where he started. He lived on a sailboat. And so he writes this book about kind of the struggles of this challenge, because this isn't just a challenge that you're like, you just kind of look at your friend one day and you're like, hey, I'm going to go swim around, Great Britain. Right, like there's some planning. The guy's not a fool. The guy's a really smart guy, actually. He's kind of into stoicism and philosophy, and he throughout his book he quotes a lot of Marcus Aurelius, who's a Roman Stoic philosopher, and I just really like Ross Edgley. I like his attitude. I don't know if he's a Christian or not, but he's just an all-around cool guy. And so in this book, The Art of Resilience, he's outlining, like, what does it mean to kind of take on this task? Because you don't just, like, have the problem of just doing the swim, right? Like, if all you had to do was just move your arm in front of you a few times, right? Like, that's fine, right? But you're swimming around an actual island where there's shipping yards and like giant container ships are coming in, and he's like, well, I got to clear this channel. And like, you can't call the guy that's running the shipping yard and say, hey, I'm going to take, however much time it takes to swim a mile across this channel. Can you just like put a pause on the economy of Great Britain while I make this swim? Like, no. He's sitting here like, okay, I got to figure out how to get through these channels and not get ran over by a shipping container, right? Because they're not going to know he's there. And then you have the challenges of like, he's spending this much time in salt water. This is kind of gross, but it is what it is. You spend that much time in salt water, it gets in your mouth, and the salt actually starts eroding the flesh of his tongue. Like chunks of his tongue start falling out of his mouth as he's doing this. Again, like we're going like, but why, right? Like it's just, and then you have this idea like you're not supposed to swim 6 to 10 hours a day in the same wetsuit over and over again. No wetsuit's designed for you to swim that much with, and so the neck on his swimsuit starts cutting into his flesh and actually gouging out a huge cut in the back of his neck. And you don't stop swimming, right? You figure out how to deal with it. And then he's got to figure out how to eat while he's swimming because it's more effective to stay in the water, because what he realized is that he can't just be like, okay, I'm going to wake up in the morning, I'm going to start swimming, I'll swim all throughout the day, and then come nighttime, I'll go sleep and do the thing. No. He has to swim when the tide's going out. And then he has to get back in the boat and set anchor while the tide's coming in, because while he was swimming, when the tide was coming back in, it was actually pushing him backwards. And in the thing where you're trying to swim 1,780 miles, you're not interested in adding an unnecessary amount of mileage to this. Like, you're just like, I already swam this far, don't really want to do it twice. So then his sleeping patterns had to change. All these things had to change in order for him to accomplish this feat. Right? And it's like this amazing feat. And you're just kind of like, what in the world? Like, this guy, he's got something going on in his head. In one of his chapters of his book, he starts off this chapter talking about the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And it's this idea that this psychologist, Maslow, developed this pyramid, more or less. And he's like, you can't ascend this pyramid without the bottom level being taken care of. Right? So the bottom level is like the basic bare necessities: breathing, food, water, shelter. That's your basic needs. If you don't have any of those met, you don't ascend to the next level. Right? And Ross is looking at all this and he's like, I'm trying to reach this self-actualization. I'm trying to be the epitome of what it means to be a human and push myself to these limits. But you can't do it if you're not there. Like, if anything in those lower needs is treading on him, he's going to wear out. He's not going to finish this swim. He's not going to have any of this resilience. And then, funny as it is, in the midst of doing all these things that are already, you're like, this is hard, right? This is hard. Life does what it does. And I'll just read for you a little excerpt from the book as he continues in this chapter. After 83 days at sea, a little more than half, unknown to him, he didn't know how many more days he had left. But after 83 days at sea, having covered 1,000 miles to this point, I receive a call from my brother that my dad's in the hospital and has an aggressive form of cancer. In that moment, storms and dangerous currents no longer mattered. Physically, I was fine, and the remaining mileage actually seemed doable. I'm going to believe him, right? Like, he's done that much. But news of my dad's health felt like I'd been punched in the stomach and run over by that French cargo ship. This is why my first thought was to cancel the swim and return to land so I could be with him and the family. I wasn't thinking clearly. I had forgotten everything I had learned about stoicism and being mentally tough, and was now purely thinking through emotionally charged, reflexive reactions rather than logic. I mean, all of us are probably kind of like, no, actually, you might have been a bit more logical. right? Like most of us are probably like, no, I'm not relating with you on this one. So at this time, it says, my brother Scott hands the phone to my mom so she can try and talk some sense into me. Apparently this is like a family thing. They're all kind of built a little different. Mom says, Dad has asked if you can make him a promise. Of course, was my immediate reply. You have to promise you will come home, but only via the beach at Margate once you've finished what you started. Promise? As a dutiful son, I promised. From his hospital bed, my dad, in the face of sheer adversity, still wanted me to realize the power of seeking a higher purpose. Now, in the end, I don't want to spoil it, but I'm going to assume that most of you probably aren't going to go and read this. He finishes it, and his dad is on that beach. But that entire rest of that swim, there's this giant question mark. But what got him through it was this understanding of a higher purpose. Now, in his world, this idea of a higher purpose was ascending this hierarchy of needs, becoming self-actualized, right? Being the epitome of what it means to be human. Right? This higher purpose got him through the rest of these 80, 70 some odd days he had left. 74 more days of swimming, 780 more miles to go. Like this moment of remembering the promise in and of itself, right? He makes the promise to his dad, but that doesn't mean that the next 74 days became that much easier for him. It didn't take away from this the fact that he had this unknown sitting in the back of his mind that maybe I get the call today. And I should have just canceled this. Right? It's this higher purpose that gets him through, this promise to his dad that gets him through this incredibly difficult challenge. Similarly to that moment for Ross is what we get in this little glimpse of verse 23 for Ruth. The temptation, right, because of how quickly this whole thing unfolds, and we read through this book, you can do it in like a matter of 10 minutes, you can read the whole story of Ruth. The temptation is to kind of remove ourselves from this understanding of time. Remember, I said time is important to keep in mind. Verse 23 says, so Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. The barley and wheat harvest is about 2 to 3 months. 2 to 3 months. The problems that Ruth was facing, just because she had this good day, didn't erase the work she had in front of her. She didn't get to sit there and be like, well, I don't have to do any more gleaning. Don't have to spend all day in a field anymore. No. For almost the span of 3 months, Ruth gets up every day other than the Sabbath, goes out in a field, risking herself every time she walks there to get to this field, hoping to get to the field for safety, but she goes to that field and she harvests because they still need food. And because she's sticking to her words that where her mother-in-law goes, she goes. That not even death itself can take her away. She's staying with her mom, and she's resolved, she's resilient, and she proves her resilience through every day getting up and doing it all over again. When we hear about Ross's higher purpose, I listen to it, like as a believer, I'm just like, Ross, there are bigger things to live for. It was so subjective, right? But as a follower of Jesus, our purpose is made clear. And I don't think that we could ask for a greater purpose. It's to love God, honor and glorify him with all we do, and to obey his commands. Right? Matthew 28:19, to go into all the world and make disciples, baptizing and teaching them. We have a clear purpose that we can honor God by obeying what he's asked us to do. But we don't have just a purpose. In and of itself, I'd argue that purpose alone is enough. But God doesn't leave us with just a purpose. He gives us a promise. The Apostle Paul says in his letter to the church in Rome, chapter 8, verse 28 in the book of Romans, he says this, and we know, this isn't a guess, this isn't a hope, we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. We know that in all things God works. We're not just asking and hoping and looking at our circumstances and saying, well, God can't work in this. We can't make that claim. Because according to Paul, we know that in all things. Right? And we also know, right? John in his letter in 1 John chapter 2, John says that our love for God is made complete by obeying his commands. That's the Kenneth summarized translation. It's not exactly word for word. Calm down. But there's this idea like our actions matter. And James, right, he says in his letter to the church, he says that faith without works is dead. What good is it if a brother or sister is hungry or cold and you just go, I'm going to pray for you. I'm not going to change anything that I'm doing. I'm not going to choose to look at my own circumstances and determine to be faithful where I am. Knowing full well that if God's working all things, even if I'm a little bit stretched, even if I'm a little bit pushed, even if I feel wasted and tired and the world keeps doing what it's doing, I'm going to choose to be faithful and obedient. And I'm not going to just fall into this idea of this mountaintop mindset. I love that we talked about camp today. So I've grown up in the church. I was fluent in Christianese by the age of 5. It's a joke. It's not a real language. Don't Google it. Some of you might.
It's called talking in tongues.
But I went to like all the camps. And I remember it was like my junior year. I go to this camp. It was one of our winter camps. All these kids are there, right? And we're getting close to that last day. And if any of you have been to camp on the last night, oh man, preacher's bringing the heat. That piano music is playing softly in the background, right? Your emotions are getting all riled up. And like half the room is like, I'm going to change. Life's going to be different from here forward. And I'll tell you what, like normally I'm just like kind of the optimist, but in that moment I was just like, bitch, you don't. You don't change. Like I felt like the guy that's at the New Year's party and everyone's talking about resolutions and he's just sitting there like, the average, the person only makes it about 2 weeks before they give up on their resolution. And everyone's just like, shut up, Ken. Like, I was just struck with this pessimism. Why? Because it's just honestly, our actions show where our faith lies. And if we're honest with ourselves, our actions don't always claim the faith that we tout so boldly. My actions don't proclaim the faith I claim to have. we should be praying and striving for a resilient faith. To be faithful in the little things is truly a big thing. Ruth doesn't know the end of her story. Just because we do doesn't mean we get to kind of go, well, it turns out okay. She moved forward in faith, nothing else. She knew what was right, and she stuck to her guns. She said, if I'm banking on someone, I'm banking on him. I'm banking on God. Life can come at me and keep doing what it does. I'm not changing my mind. Church, we're called to the same. Jesus says in his gospel in Luke, right? And if anyone wants to follow me, if anyone wants to be my disciple, let him pick up his cross and daily follow. So we're going to do something a little different. It might be kind of awkward. I'm not asking anyone to come up here, so everyone that's like not wanting to be in front of people, calm down. I'm not asking that. But we're just going to be quiet for a little bit. I think in our prayer lives, we can spend a lot of time just talking at God. I'm just wanting to invite us to a moment where we're asking him to do the talking. So I'm just going to ask that we just spend a quiet moment. And you just ask him one question. Where are you asking me to step out in faith? What do I need to start doing today to live out the faith I so desperately want to be real in my life? Let's take a moment and let's listen to him.